Media and royal commentators frame this as a major reputational crisis for the monarchy. In recent days, Buckingham Palace has been far less peaceful than it appears to the outside world. Shortly after a formal ceremony came to an end, Princess Anne reportedly caught fragments of a quiet private exchange, one she believes should never have occurred within the walls of the royal household. This was not a matter of romance, nor was it related to any conflict over titles. What has unsettled those closest to the situation the most is this: the silent currents of suspicion are now converging on a single individual. The woman King Charles has long considered his most loyal pillar of strength, Queen Camilla. Since that moment, insiders claim they have begun to observe strange and troubling signs surrounding Camilla herself. At first, everything could have been dismissed as simple coincidence until Princess Anne began subtly stepping back from public duties and was seen discreetly reaching out once again to several long-retired, highly trusted figures from the royal old guard. If there's anyone within the family known for being firm, perceptive, and unshakably clear-eyed when something threatens the throne from within, it is Anne. So what is Queen Camilla concealing that has prompted the palace's inner workings to move swiftly yet silently to contain the situation? And now that Princess Anne has witnessed things never meant to surface, will this secret remain buried forever, or could it ignite an unprecedented breakdown in the history of the British monarchy? On an afternoon in early 2026, as London's familiar fog slowly settled over the palace gardens, an internal medal ceremony had just come to an end. The occasion was meant to recognize the quiet, years-long service of palace staff, an established tradition attended by both King Charles and Queen Camilla. Princess Anne appeared in her perfectly tailored military uniform, every sharp crease reflecting the precision and discipline that defined her character. She stood in silence watching Camilla, the sister-in-law who, since officially taken on the title of Queen, had remained at the center of divided public sentiment. The connection between Anne and Camilla had never been straightforward. For decades, they had maintained a carefully balanced respect paired with an unspoken distance rooted in contrasting views of duty and royal tradition. Anne represented the old principles, restraint, and responsibility, while Camilla carried the composed strength of someone who had spent years waiting in the shadows for her place. The event should have ended without incident, if not for one small unsettling moment that occurred just after the ceremonial music faded away. As guests began to drift apart and quietly moved toward the corridor leading to the logistics office, hoping to avoid the hollow small talk of formal mingling. In that stillness from behind the half-closed wooden door of the staff restroom, tense, hushed voices has reached her. This set of records doesn't align. A man's voice quivered. The transfer code this time didn't go through the normal banking route. It went directly into a trust fund in the Caribbean. Lower your voice, another voice interrupted sharply, filled with alarm. Do you even realize where the instruction came from? The Queen's office already approved it. Don't start asking about those off the books payments unless you want to lose your pension. The name Camilla followed almost immediately, not spoken with royal respect, but with an uneasy, almost fearful caution. Anne stood completely still for someone who had devoted her life to safeguarding the monarchy's honor and transparency. Phrases like "not through the normal channel" and Caribbean trust fund struck like a jagged fracture across something meant to remain spotless. Her thoughts began tracing back through the royal household's financial dealings of recent years, searching for any missed thread. She remembered the unusually delayed annual budget statements, the costly restoration projects Camilla had personally overseen, and discreet asset movements masked as charitable contributions. Her suspicion did not arrive like a sudden storm. It crept into her slowly, cold and persistent, much like the bite of a London winter, Anne did not throw the door open or confront anyone. That was never her way. Instead, she stepped back quietly, her shoes sinking into the thick carpet as her mind weighed possibilities. Her gaze shifted toward the window where King Charles and Camilla were, smiling warmly, bidding farewell to departing guests. In that moment, Camilla's image in Anne's mind began to feel unfamiliar, almost distant. The woman standing beside her, brother elegant hat in place gracious, smile perfectly worn. Could she truly be managing a concealed financial network beneath the king's awareness? A slow, searing sense of betrayal rose within Anne. If the staff member's words were true, this was not simply about personal benefit, it was a corrosive act, threatening the very foundations of the monarchy Anne had always honored. Anne did not return to the main hall. Instead, she turned toward the private library, a place filled with historical records and the complex network of trusted connections she had built over decades of unwavering service. That night, under the dim golden light of her study, and sat before the blank pages of the upcoming schedule. She did not read them. Her eyes remained fixed on an undefined emptiness where unfamiliar names and billions of pounds seemed to swirl. A deep, unsettling weight settled over her. This was no longer harmless servant gossip. This was the opening of a battle she had never wanted to face, and one she would never allow herself to abandon. At this moment, Anne's thoughts felt like a chessboard thrown into disorder by pieces she had never expected to see. The words, "not through the usual Channel and Caribbean," continued to circle endlessly in her mind, pressing her toward action. Yet, she knew any move she made would have to remain completely unseen, leaving no footprint behind. Anne understood that within a structure as traditional and tightly controlled as Buckingham Palace, asking direct questions of the finance department would be the equivalent of triggering an alarm. Instead, she began quietly reaching into what could only be called the palace's gray network, long-standing contacts and retired advisors whose loyalty to her remained absolute. These individuals were like living archives, guardians of knowledge about the movement of royal assets, dating back to the reign of the late Queen. Most of her days were spent inside her private study, its walls covered with shelves of aged, leather-bound volumes, rather than relying on modern digital tools that could easily be traced. Anne deliberately chose an older, safer approach. She retrieved archived expenditure files from the Queen's office, dating back 2 years, the exact period following Camilla's official rise to her new title. Her fingertips moved slowly across the numbers while her keen gaze lingered on entries marked supplementary maintenance costs linked to overseas royal engagements. It did not take long for the irregularity to reveal itself. Budgets were repeatedly set about 15% above what was truly needed, and the missing portion always disappeared behind vague, poorly explained notes. Anne's careful diligence soon began to transform into a quiet sense of dread as the scope of the issue unfolded. To strengthen her suspicions, she arranged discreet meetings under the harmless cover of courtesy visits. One afternoon, she called upon a former royal treasurer who now lived in peaceful retirement on the city's outskirts over tea. Without asking a single direct question, she merely spoke in subtle terms about protecting the legacy for those who come after us. In response, she received knowing nods and scattered fragments of information pointing toward a web of shell companies operating out of Luxembourg and Monaco. The picture Anne was assembling gradually took on a frightening clarity. This was not a case of Camilla occasionally taking small amounts from the common fund. It was an advanced laundering operation, one carefully designed to transform public resources into private wealth, hidden in the form of extravagant villas along the Mediterranean coast. None of these properties carried Camilla's name. Instead, they belonged to corporate entities controlled by distant relatives or trusted associates from her earlier life as Mrs. Parker B.S. With every new layer she uncovered, an icy chill crept down Anne's spine. Images formed in her mind. Frankfurt skyscrapers, lavish apartments in Paris, all marked by the presence of accomplices Camilla had quietly placed within the royal administrative structure. This network had been growing for years, perhaps, even before Charles ever took the throne. Carefully constructed, his preparation for a financial empire beyond the reach of parliament or government oversight. Anne became more guarded than ever. Each night, she developed the habit of personally destroying her private notes using a small shredder hidden in the corner of her room. She could feel tension tightening through her entire body. In public appearances and family dinners, she was forced to wear a flawless mask of calm control. She watched Camilla, the woman who still serenely drank tea while discussing charitable causes with a disgust she kept buried. Beneath that polished aristocratic surface, Anne now saw a hand quietly draining the strength of the throne piece by piece, feeding an endless personal fortune. Then she discovered a thin folder misplaced among agricultural documents. Inside was a list of international corporate shares transferred as unnamed gifts. One entry led directly to a concealed Swiss bank account, its code matching exactly what Anne had overheard in the corridor only days earlier. She stood frozen in the archive's darkness, breathing sharply. The scale of what she was seeing could no longer be counted in millions, but in billions of pounds. An amount powerful enough to shatter the monarchy's credibility if revealed the wrong way. Anne understood now that she was not simply confronting a greedy sister-in-law. She was facing a financial monster nourished by her brother King Charles's silence and misplaced trust. The documents were only lifeless figures on paper. What she needed next was the final confirmation. She needed to look directly into Camilla's eyes. This silent war had reached the point from which there was no turning back. After countless nights spent buried in dusty archives, Princess Anne came to the conclusion that remaining hidden behind shelves of documents was no longer enough. What she needed now was confirmation, not through ink and numbers, but through the instinct of someone who had spent her entire life reading the subtle movements of those who operated within the highest circles of power. One late afternoon, as a blood-red sunset spilled through the stained glass windows of the small tea room at Clarence's house, Anne arranged a private meeting with Camila. The tea table was a flawlessly prepared set with rare bone china. Yet the atmosphere was heavy with watchfulness. Anne sat perfectly upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a posture that reflected complete discipline and restraint. She did not lift the steaming cup, choosing instead to watch the woman opposite her with razor-sharp focus, tracking even the smallest gesture. Camilla, in contrast, maintained a deliberate calm. She stirred her tea slowly, the spoon tapping softly against the porcelain, breaking the silence while tightening the invisible tension that hung between them. Anne began with seemingly harmless inquiries about the financial health of the charitable funds Camilla supported. Carefully, she slipped in technical language phrases such as trust funds and overseas investments like hidden snares within polite conversation. Each time one of these sensitive terms appeared and detected minute shifts in Camilla's expression, a blink that came too quickly, a breath held for just a second longer, or the faint tightening of fingers around a napkin. These were signals only someone seasoned in controlled environments could notice. The strain between them reached its sharpest point when Anne remarked that transparency is the only shield protecting the monarchy from global financial storms. Their eyes locked for a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly. The pleasant mask Camilla wore appeared to fracture. There was no outright confession nor any fierce denial. Instead, Camilla responded in a low, carefully measured voice, one that carried a warning beneath the surface, cloaked in the language of loyalty. Camilla did not dispute the enormous sums Anne had indirectly referenced. Through vague suggestions about personal sacrifice for the survival of the monarchy, she implied that her actions, however questionable or unlawful, were necessary preparations to ensure the royal family would never become dependent on government control in the years ahead. It was an unsettling justification reshaping greed into supposed duty. Camilla's gaze fixed on Anne, no longer that of a gracious queen, but of someone inviting her into the shadows, urging her to join in protecting the Windsor name. A surge of disgust rose in Anne's chest. She realized Camilla was not truly afraid of exposure. She was unsettled because she could not bring Anne onto her side. That refusal to admit or deny was in reality a silent declaration of war. Camilla was forcing Anne into an impossible dilemma. If Anne revealed the truth, she would shake the very institution she had dedicated her life to defending. If she remained silent, she would become complicit. The meeting ended without a single direct accusation spoken aloud, yet the reality stood unmistakably between them. As Anne rose to leave, she felt the icy weight of Camilla's stare burning into her back. It was the look of someone prepared to do whatever was necessary, no matter how ruthless, to prevent her secret from escaping. Stepping outside Clarence's house, Anne inhaled deeply the cold night air filling her lungs. She understood she had pushed Camilla into a corner, and a cornered creature would soon reveal its teeth and claws. That confrontation cemented Anne's certainty. What she had uncovered was not merely an unpleasant truth, but a malignant tumor that had spread far too deeply. Camilla was not simply a woman seeking financial safety. She was a strategist running a sophisticated network willing to discard every moral boundary in pursuit of an unnamed form of power. With the instincts of a trained soldier, Princess Anne sensed the change in Buckingham Palace's atmosphere the very next morning. The looks from junior staff people who had always kept their eyes lowered around her now carried an uneasy fear. Footsteps in the corridors sounded hurried, and whispered conversations abruptly stopped the moment she appeared. Everything suggested one unmistakable truth: Camilla had begun to act. Camilla did not choose open confrontation. Instead, she used the quiet authority of a queen to initiate what amounted to a sweeping purge of information. Anne noticed professional shredding trucks arriving at the palace's rear entrance at unusual hours. Financial files she intended to examine again were suddenly declared relocated to an off-site archive or mysteriously listed as damaged due to a burst water pipe. Several crucial figures within the asset management division, individuals who had previously remained neutral, unexpectedly resigned, offering excuses of illness or family emergencies. While Camilla worked desperately to seal every opening, Anne maintained an outward calm that was almost unnerving. She continued attending military events, cutting ribbons at charity functions with flawless mechanical precision. Yet beneath her composed exterior, her mind was racing. Anne understood that when an opponent begins to panic and erase evidence, that is exactly when they are most vulnerable to making new errors. The shift, she realized, centered around one key name: Sir Alistair, a seasoned financial advisor who had abruptly taken early retirement only months before King Charles's coronation. Anne recalled the strained anxiety on his face during his farewell ceremony, a rushed departure that seemed unnatural for a man who had served the royal household for 3 decades. Using a private line of communication that completely bypassed the palace switchboard and tracked him down to a remote farm in the Scottish Highlands where he was now living under an assumed identity. The meeting took place during an afternoon of relentless rain. Anne drove herself without any escort to reach the man who was trembling under the constant fear of being eliminated. The once-so-polished advisor had become a hollow, gaunt figure surviving in a state of relentless vigilance. Inside the small room, heavy with the smell of damp and decaying wood, Alistair finally confessed in a broken whisper. He spoke of handwritten instructions from Camilla, ordering him to make the money flows disappear, of sleepless nights spent destroying original documents tied to investments hidden in offshore tax havens. But the true turning point came when Alistair slowly pulled an old iron box from beneath his bed. His hands shook as he opened it, revealing microfilm copies and carefully laminated papers. He admitted that, horrified by the sheer scale of the conspiracy and desperate to avoid being silenced, he had secretly duplicated the entire financial blueprint leading directly to Camilla's concealed accounts. These records documented not only the staggering sums involved, but also the confirming signatures of accomplices operating within the hidden network. Anne held the files in her hands, feeling their weight. The kind of weight that could ruin one individual completely, yet perhaps preserve the integrity of an entire royal dynasty. Alistair looked at her with desperate remorse and pleading. He agreed to come forward as a witness, but only if Anne could guarantee the safety of his family. His decision was not driven by bravery, but by the understanding that Princess Anne was the only person with enough authority and enough resolve to bring this nightmare to an end. That morning, Buckingham Palace was wrapped in an unfamiliar tension of false quiet, settling over corridors lined with deep crimson carpets. Princess Anne had demanded an emergency, highly confidential meeting inside the king's office, with attendance strictly restricted to King Charles and only a small circle of senior Privy Council members. When the heavy oak doors closed with a decisive thud, the air inside the room became dense with strain. King Charles sat at the center, his face marked by exhaustion and confusion at the sudden seriousness carried by his sister. Across from him, Camilla remained seated with the flawless composure of a queen, her hands neatly folded on the polished table. Yet, the moment she noticed the leather briefcase, Anne carried a brief flicker of alarm flashed in her eyes. Anne did not open with dramatic accusations. With the cold efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime managing royal duty, she began placing one file after another before them. Microfilm duplicates complex networks of money trails spun like spider silk, and Sir Alistair's signed sworn testimony were laid out in front of the sovereign. Each page turned struck the room like a hammer against the oppressive silence. Anne's steady finger pointed to the billions of pounds roaded through offshore tax havens to account codes that directly matched Camilla's private financial dealings across Europe. King Charles stared at the evidence in tortured disbelief, his eyes shifting from the cold figures on paper to the woman beside him, searching desperately for an explanation, yet meeting only a chilling silence. Camilla, meanwhile, held an almost unnatural calm, though beneath the table her fingers tightened until they turned pale. Any remaining confidence shattered as she understood Anne did not possess rumors. She held undeniable proof. The confrontation reached its breaking point when Anne revealed documentation of Camilla's direct cooperation with financial advisors and profiting from public assets. This was no longer a private family scandal. It was an act of national betrayal. Anne stood tall, her gaze fixed on her brother, demanding unwavering justice. She did not call for a public courtroom trial, but she insisted on punishment equal to the magnitude of the crime. The question hanging over the room was no longer, is Camilla guilty, but rather, will the monarchy choose justice or cling to the illusion of survival? In that breathless moment, King Charles seemed to age years in an instant. He was forced into a brutal decision: shield the woman he loved or protect the honor of the throne entrusted to him by generations of ancestors. After a silence that felt endless, he finally nodded slowly, a nod of surrender to reality. He agreed to enforce the most severe penalty possible within the royal household, but with one uncompromising condition: everything must remain completely hidden from the public to prevent a political earthquake capable of bringing the monarchy down. The verdict was delivered within the sealed shadows of that room. Camila would be permanently removed from all financial authority, placed under strict Privy Council supervision, and stripped of any genuine power inside the palace. She would remain only as a symbolic presence beside the king, a queen in title alone, confined behind gilded walls without true influence. In the final moments of the meeting, Anne's eyes met Camilla's one last time. There was no victory in her expression, only deep and lasting sorrow. She had preserved the monarchy, but the cost was the destruction of a family bond and a trust that could never be restored. The weeks that followed the sealed closed-door meeting unfolded in an eerie and almost unsettling stillness throughout Buckingham Palace. To the public eye, everything seemed to continue as normal. The changing of the guard moved with perfect routine. Royal tours proceeded exactly as scheduled, and the familiar rehearsed smiles of the royal family continued to fill the newspaper headlines. Yet behind the thick oak doors, a quiet earthquake had occurred, one that left permanent fractures within the Windsor power structure. Queen Camilla now appeared like a shadow wandering through her own residence. Her public engagements became increasingly infrequent, and whenever she stood beside King Charles, the sharp confidence she once carried had disappeared. In its place was a disturbing silence. Her gaze avoided the cameras, fixed instead on some distant emptiness. She no longer played any role in the major decisions of the king's office, nor did she retain the financial influence she once held. Every movement she made, every expense she authorized was now monitored under the strict oversight of an internal investigative committee formed at Anne's insistence. At the same time, a covert recovery operation was unfolding with relentless intensity, yet under absolute secrecy. Princess Anne personally supervised the dismantling of the shell companies and the return of the enormous fortune hidden in offshore tax havens. Funds began flowing back into royal accounts disguised under labels such as surplus investment gains or repatriated donations. Camilla's collaborators, from corrupt financial advisors to compromised property managers, vanished one by one from the administrative structure. Some entered sudden early retirement, while others were quietly reassigned to powerless roles in distant locations, all carried out under the unbreakable discipline of royal silence. The bond between the monarchy's two most powerful women had now turned to ice. At the rare formal banquets, where both appeared, Anne maintained flawless etiquette, her calm as unyielding as iron. She never met Camilla's eyes directly, yet. Her presence alone became a constant reminder of the humiliation and defeat Camilla was forced to endure. For Anne, this was not revenge. It was a necessary operation, a surgical removal of the tumor eating away at the family's honor. King Charles, too, began to change in complex and painful ways. He spent more and more time wandering the gardens at Highgrove, withdrawing from the bitter truth that the woman he had trusted completely had betrayed the very ideals he cherished. The rupture between him and Camilla did not surface through loud arguments, but through an ever-growing emotional and physical distance. They remained under the same roof, yet seemed to exist in entirely separate worlds, one struggling to preserve the monarchy, the other slowly fading within invisible confinement. Beyond the palace walls, journalists and political observers began whispering with increasing suspicion. Questions grew about the Queen's absences, the sudden staff departures, and the unusual financial movements buried within annual budget reports. Yet, because of Anne's discipline and airtight secrecy, no definitive proof ever surfaced. The core truth, billions of pounds and a hidden financial empire, remained deeply buried beneath velvet carpets and solemn vows of silence. The monarchy survived the undercurrent, but the family's innocence and trust were lost forever. Anne turned and walked back inside, leaving behind the gathering darkness over London. She resumed her position as the unwavering guardian of the institution, willing to sacrifice everything to keep the throne shining, no matter if the cost was eternal solitude at the very summit of power. Now that the story has ended, what do you think? Was the decision by Princess Anne and King Charles to keep the truth hidden a noble sacrifice made to preserve the monarchy's stability? Or was it ultimately a compromise that ensured justice could never truly be carried out in the eyes of the public? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. And be sure to click the next video appearing on your screen. You're going to enjoy.